In a luxurious room where billion-dollar decisions are made between sips of expensive wine, a simple intellectual challenge transforms an ordinary night into a silent battlefield. Surrounded by brilliant executives, at least on paper, a tycoon tosses out an impossible question, hoping to expose weaknesses and reaffirm his dominance. But in the corner of the room, someone invisible observes, understands, and sees far beyond everyone there. When this person finally speaks, they don't just answer. They redefine the rules of the game, leaving the room in absolute silence. Before discovering how a genius question revealed an even more brilliant mind, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more intense stories full of twists. The lounge at the Liberty Heights Golf Club had that specific scent of places where money ages well: hardwood, imported leather, and the faint trail of a cigar extinguished hours ago. Bronze lamps cast golden cones over the tables, and the murmur of conversation blended with the discreet clinking of crystal glasses. It was a Thursday night, and the private room on the third floor, reserved only for platinum-level members, was occupied by 7 men who collectively shared a declared net worth of over $4 billion. Maya Vance walked through the service door with the tray balanced on her right forearm, her black uniform impeccable, her hair pulled back with almost military precision. She was 38 years old, but she carried in her eyes the density of someone who had lived 2 entire lives. No one inside knew that. No one inside bothered to know. She set down the glasses with surgical silence, moving between the chairs as if she were part of the room's architecture. She had mastered this skill over the last 2 years, the art of existing without taking up space, of hearing without being noticed, of observing without ever being observed back. To the men at that table, she was simply the waitress, a functional shadow with a tray. At the center of the table, Richard Drummond leaned back in his chair with the authority of someone who never needed to justify his presence anywhere. 52 years old, graying hair cut with precision, dark blazer with no tie. Drummond was the type of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. He had founded his investment holding company 20 years ago, starting from a regional fund in Chicago, and had built an empire that touched mining, energy, and port infrastructure. He was respected, and he was feared even more than he was respected. Around him, the other 6 executives drank and laughed with that performative lightness of those who need to appear relaxed in front of the boss. There were CFOs, a private equity partner, and an M&A consultant, all with shiny MBAs, all with the right suits and the right watches and the right words on the tips of their tongues. Maya collected the used glasses and turned toward the exit, when Drummond's voice cut through the air with the casualness of someone just making small talk. "I'm going to propose a problem to you all," he said without warning, without ceremony. His tone was almost bored. "I want to see how you think when the floor disappears from under your feet." The executives straightened up. Maya paused imperceptibly, 2 steps from the door, tray still in hand. There was no reason for her to leave immediately. There were napkins to collect. There was water to refill. There were 100 small justifications to stay. Drummond crossed his fingers on the table and looked at each person present as if evaluating pieces on a board. "A plot of land in rural Pennsylvania," he began. 2,000 acres. Inside this land is a diamond mine that was partially explored in the 90s. Very promising in the initial reports. Good stone quality, reasonable depth. The problem is that the water table breached during expansion and the entire mine was flooded. Today, the water is 130 feet below the surface, and extraction is technically unfeasible. The cost of pumping and shoring would be 3 times any possible revenue from the stones that remain. He paused to take a sip of his whiskey. "There is an interested buyer, an industrial group from Ohio that wants the land to build a regional warehouse and distribution center. But the price they're offering is derisory. They know the mine doesn't work and treat the land like any unproductive rural area. The challenge is simple. How do you make this buyer pay 10 times more for the land without them realizing they're being played, without doing anything illegal, and without the actual value of the asset justifying the price?" The silence that followed was heavy. The executives exchanged looks. Some feigned intense thought. Others picked up their phones as if looking for a technical reference. Maya, with her back to the table, was folding a cloth napkin with excessive attention. The first to speak was Grant Miller, the holding company's CFO, a 40-year-old man with the confidence of someone rarely contradicted. You create artificial scarcity. You put it out in the market that there's another interested party, a Canadian mining company, let's say. You increase the perception of competition, and the buyer rushes in. Drummond tilted his head. And when the Canadian mining company doesn't show up to sign anything, when the buyer discovers it was a fantasy, the contract falls through, you lose credibility, and the deal dies. Next. Robert Payne, the M&A consultant, adjusted his glasses and tried. You restructure the valuation based on future geological potential, project a hypothetical extraction scenario with technology that doesn't exist in the domestic market yet, but is being developed. Sell the land as a long-term speculative asset. Drummond smiled with his mouth, not his eyes. A buyer who wants to build an industrial warehouse doesn't have a 20-year horizon to wait for underground pumping technology. He wants flat ground and highway access. Next. One by one, the executives offered solutions. One suggested partitioning the land and selling it in pieces, hiding the flooded mine among smaller lots. Drummond dismissed it. Basic due diligence would reveal everything. Another proposed creating an intermediary holding company to opaque the asset's history. Drummond was even colder. Title searches, property registries, nothing disappears. A third tried an argument about carbon credits and preservation areas, and Drummond simply looked at him for 3 seconds without saying a word, which was enough for the man to back down. After 20 minutes, the room was heavy with the specific silence of collective defeat. Drummond drummed his fingers on the table. Then he decided to do what Maya, without anyone noticing, had already predicted he would do. He was the kind of man who stretched cruelty to the last available possibility. He slowly turned his head and stared at the waitress who had been folding the same napkin for 4 minutes. "You," he said, with a curiosity that sounded more like a challenge. "What would you do?" The executives laughed, some with discomfort, others with genuine amusement. It was the joke of the moment, asking the waitress what the best financial strategists in Manhattan hadn't been able to answer. Maya turned around slowly. She set down the napkin. She faced Richard Drummond with a tranquility that wasn't shyness and wasn't arrogance. It was something older and more stable than either. "Do you want me to answer?" she asked in a low and absolutely firm voice. Drummond opened his hands in a gesture that said, "Surprise me if you can." Maya stood still for 2 seconds, not hesitating, organizing. There was a very clear difference between the two, and she had known how to distinguish them since the days she made decisions that moved hundreds of millions of dollars in a single afternoon. "I wouldn't negotiate with the buyer," she said. "I would pressure his creditors." The sentence landed in the center of the table like a stone in a pond. None of the executives spoke. Drummond drummed his fingers one last time, and then stopped, completely still, eyes fixed on that woman in the black uniform who held a tray with the same serenity as someone holding a dossier. The silence that settled in the private room at Liberty Heights had a different texture than the previous silence. Before, it was the silence of collective failure, heavy and ashamed. Now, it was something else. It was the silence of someone who doesn't know what they're about to hear, but has already sensed it will be something that cannot be easily ignored. Richard Drummond didn't move. He just watched that woman with an attention that had changed in quality over the last 30 seconds. It was no longer the condescending attention of someone making a joke with the most unlikely subordinate in the room. It was real, sharp attention, the kind he reserved for meetings that actually mattered. "Continue," he said. Just that. The word fell short and direct, as it always did when he was genuinely interested. Maya placed the tray on the sideboard with a silent, natural movement, as if it were part of the service. Then she crossed her hands in front of her body and spoke with the cadence of someone who had already built the entire argument before opening her mouth. "The mine is flooded," she began. "Everyone knows that. The buyer knows, the market knows, the reports are on public record. There's no way to hide the problem or inflate the asset's value based on what it is. So the question isn't what the land is worth, but what happens if the buyer doesn't acquire it under the conditions you determine." Grant Miller, the CFO, frowned. Robert Payne, the consultant, leaned back slightly, like someone beginning to foresee where this was going. The water filling the mine exerts pressure on the surrounding soil, Meyer continued. 130 feet of water column doesn't just sit still, it pushes. And if the neighboring land has a permeable geological composition, that pressure is transmitted laterally in a progressive way. Depending on the subsoil structure, the abrupt removal of that water by forced pumping could destabilize a considerable strip around the mine. Drummond leaned his body a millimeter forward. It was the most interest he allowed himself to show. This means that the land where the Ohio Group intends to build the industrial warehouse is within that geological zone of influence. And the banks financing the construction of that warehouse don't know that, because no one ever asked for a subsoil stability report for that specific region. They did due diligence on the property they're acquiring, but not on the immediate geological neighborhood. She paused briefly. Not for dramatic effect, just because she was being precise. You hire a reputable geotechnical engineering firm, preferably with international credentials, to issue a technical opinion on the risk of subsidence in the area if there is a change in the water level of the adjacent mine. This opinion is sent by formal protocol to the three main lending banks of the buyer group, not as a threat, as an extended due diligence obligation, which any responsible risk manager should demand. What happens next? Drummond asked. His voice was completely neutral, but his eyes were not. The banks freeze the credit line while they evaluate the risk, Meyer replied without hesitating. The Ohio Group misses the financing deadline for the project. To unlock the credit, they need to present a solution for the geological risk. The only technically feasible solution is to also acquire the mine land and assume control of the water level. At that moment, the land that was worth little as inert rural area becomes the only asset that clears an investment of tens of millions of dollars already committed. The price they pay won't reflect the value of the mine. It will reflect the cost of not buying it. The room went completely still. It wasn't the kind of pause that precedes applause. It was the kind of pause that precedes a silent re-evaluation. The executives looked at the table, at their glasses, at their own hands. Anything but looking directly at the woman in the black uniform who had just made everything they attempted look irrelevant. Grant Miller opened his mouth once and closed it. Robert Payne swirled his whiskey glass without drinking. Drummond stared at Meyer for a long moment. Then he said, with a calmness that was in itself a form of respect, a question that didn't sound like a question. "Who are you?" There was no interrogative inflection in his voice. It was a statement in disguise. He already knew by the quality of the reasoning that this answer hadn't come from a culinary school or from 2 years ago. That answer had come from a place that took a long time to build and very little time to destroy if the wrong circumstances aligned the wrong way. Meyer didn't answer immediately. She picked up the tray again, as if the gesture signaled the end of something. "I'm the person who serves the coffee here," she said, "and there's another round for you, gentlemen, if you wish." She left through the service door with the same silent step she had entered with, and the room, which had been the stage for $4 billion in concentrated power, remained for a moment suspended in a kind of collective disorientation that none of those men would have known how to name precisely, but which they all recognized by instinct as the feeling of having been surpassed by someone they had decided not to see. Drummond was alone with his thoughts for less than 10 seconds. Then he called his assistant with a single hand gesture and said, low enough so only he could hear 4 words, "Find out who she is." On the other side of the service door, Meyer leaned briefly against the hallway wall. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. There was no triumph in what she felt. There was something more complicated than triumph. There was the recognition that she had spoken when she should have stayed silent, that she had shown something that should have remained hidden, and that, from that moment on, the invisibility that had protected her for 2 years was irretrievably compromised. She opened her eyes, straightened her shoulders, took the service elevator back to the ground floor. Outside, through the club's glass windows, the lights of Liberty Heights formed a horizontal constellation that stretched out toward the suburbs. It was a city that didn't sleep and didn't forget. Meyer knew that better than most. She had survived 2 years being nobody. Now she would have to find out if she could survive being herself again. That night, back in the small apartment she rented in the East End, Maya sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and looked at the wall. The apartment was functional and empty in the specific way of places that serve only for sleeping. There were no pictures, there were few books. There was, in a locked drawer, a folder with documents she hadn't opened in many months, because opening that folder meant remembering, and remembering had cost far too much. She thought of Drummond's look. It was the look of someone who recognizes, even without knowing exactly what, that they are facing something that shouldn't be where it is, like finding a chess piece on the wrong board. She turned off the kitchen light and went to sleep without opening the drawer. But well before dawn, Maya woke up with that strange clarity that sometimes comes in the middle of the night, like a light bulb that turns on by itself. She stared at the ceiling and thought of something she hadn't thought of at the club, but which now imposed itself with the coldness of something that arrives late, but arrives nonetheless. She knew who the Ohio buyer group was, not the name of the group, not the registered partners, but she knew the pattern. She knew the type of operation that buys industrial land in strategic regions, using capital that needs a destination with the appearance of a real estate asset. She had seen that pattern before, years before, in a dossier that had crossed her desk at a time when she still had a desk for things to cross. She closed her eyes again. It was possible it was a coincidence. It was also possible it was nothing of the sort. Richard Drummond's assistant was named Vincent Lane. He was 26 years old and had the specific skill of finding information that people preferred not to have found. He wasn't an investigator. He was just someone who knew where to look, who asked the right people with the right words, and who understood that someone's silence on a certain subject was in itself valuable information. The morning after the dinner at the club, Vincent arrived at Drummond's office on the 17th floor of a corporate tower in the financial district with 3 printed sheets and an expression that mixed efficiency with something very close to contained admiration. "Her name is Maya Vance," he said, handing over the sheets. 38 years old, MBA from Wharton with a specialization in corporate finance from the London School of Economics. She was the Director of Strategy and Finance at Vance & White Investments between 2012 and 2022. The firm was mid-sized, but with a very solid positioning in private equity funds for regional infrastructure. Assets under management reached $2.3 billion at its peak. Drummond took the sheets and read without rushing. "And what happened in 2022?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the paper. Vincent hesitated for a second. "It's a complicated point," he said. "The official report talks about accounting irregularities detected in an internal audit. The SEC opened a preliminary investigation. Her partner, Silas Thorne, testified and pointed to Maya as responsible for the inconsistencies. She was cautiously removed from her position. The investigation dragged on for 18 months and was eventually closed for insufficient evidence. But by then the company had already changed its name. Thorne took total control, and her reputation in the market was destroyed." Drummond raised his eyes from the sheets for the first time. "Closed for insufficient evidence," he repeated, slowly, with the tone of someone distinguishing between 2 possible interpretations of the same phrase. Vincent confirmed with a nod. Drummond set the sheets on the desk and stared out the window for a moment. Outside, the river reflected the morning sky with that greenish hue that made it beautiful from a distance and problematic up close. "Set up a meeting with her," Drummond said. Vincent blinked. "She works as a waitress at the club," he said carefully. "I don't have a professional contact for her." "Then go to the club and hand her my personal card with a time," Drummond said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "And Vincent," he added without looking back, "don't tell anyone what you just presented to me." The assistant left without making a sound. Maya learned of the message at the start of the afternoon shift when the club coordinator called her aside and handed her the card with an expression that mixed curiosity with the professional discretion the job required. It was a simple card, white, with the name embossed. On the back, a direct handwriting. "Thursday, 10 in the morning, Atlantic Tower, 17th floor. If you prefer not to come, there is no obligation." Maya read the card twice, put it in her apron pocket. She spent the rest of the shift serving tables with the same precision as always, but something had changed in the way she moved through the lounge. She wasn't rushed or agitated. She was more like a person who had made a decision and was waiting for the right moment to execute it. On Wednesday night, she opened the locked drawer. The folder was exactly as she had left it. 2 inches of paper, some handwritten notes, copies of emails printed before her removal, statements of financial movements she had kept by instinct or precaution, not knowing for sure which motivation was stronger. There was also a flash drive inside a small envelope that she hadn't connected to any computer since the day she packed her belongings in the Vanson White office and left through the elevator for the last time. She spent 2 hours rereading the documents, not out of nostalgia, for recalibration, like a pilot reviewing instruments before taking off in adverse conditions. On Thursday morning, Maya arrived at Atlantic Tower 15 minutes early. She had traded the uniform for black trousers, a grey silk blouse, and a blazer she had kept in the back of the wardrobe, with the silent hope that one day she would need it again. She looked good, she was composed, and she was, for the first time in a long time, completely awake in the sense that mattered. The receptionist on the 17th floor led her directly to the conference room. No waiting room, no coffee offered as a power protocol. Drummond was standing by the window when she entered, which was, she knew, a deliberate choice. Standing was a way to equalize the meeting from the start. He pointed to a chair, and she sat. He sat across from her. "I know who you are," Drummond said. No preamble, no performative kindness. "Then you have an initial advantage," Maya replied in the same tone. Drummond crossed his arms on the table. "I want you to execute the plan you presented the other night, with my holding company's resources, with access to the data you need, and with a consulting contract that remunerates your work appropriately." Maya didn't answer immediately. She looked at him with the attention of someone evaluating not just what was said, but everything that wasn't. "Why me?" she asked. "You have an entire team of strategists." "Because my entire team spent 20 minutes failing a question you answered in 3, Drummond said. "And because people who have already lost everything once and kept standing tend to be harder to buy and harder to intimidate than those who have never lost anything." It was a compliment that sounded like a clinical analysis. Maya decided she preferred it that way. "There is one condition," she said. Drummond waited. "I need complete access to the history of the operation, the buyer, the intermediaries, the financing chain. Not just enough to execute the plan, everything." "Why?" he asked. "Because there's something in this operation that isn't what it seems," Maya said, "and I prefer to know what I'm touching before I put my hands on it." Drummond stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, with a voice that revealed neither agreement nor refusal, just the calculated openness of someone deciding to give some rope to see what the other person does with it. "You'll have access to whatever you need." Maya nodded. She extended her hand. He shook it firmly. Outside the room, while Vincent prepared the provisional contract, Maya stood before the hallway window and looked at the city below. The metropolis spread out in all directions, with that mixture of beauty and complexity that made it impossible to look at with innocence. She was back, and this time, she thought, no one would choose the moment she left. That afternoon, Maya stayed alone for 2 hours in the holding company's data room, in front of 3 monitors and a volume of documentation that another person would take days to organize. She took 40 minutes. She had the old habit of reading financial reports for what they didn't say, for the white spaces between the revenue lines, for the footnotes that usually hide what the body of the document prefers not to explain. The buyer group was called Ohio Logistics and Distribution Corp., incorporated 3 years ago, modest paid-in capital for the size of the operation it proposed. The partners were names she didn't recognize, but the money trails leading to that company came from intermediary holdings with addresses in Chicago, and one of them had a corporate name that Maya read twice before resting her eyes on the wall for a full second. She took a deep breath and kept reading. Silas Thorne was 51 years old and had the meticulous appearance of someone who had built their own image with the same care an architect builds a facade. Everything calculated to impress from a distance and reveal as little as possible up close. dark hair with a touch of grey at the temples that he cultivated on purpose because it conferred authority without aging him, bespoke suits, a voice that modulated between warm and intimidating with the fluidity of someone who had practiced the transition for decades. Maya had worked alongside him for 10 years, and it had taken exactly 2 years, 5 months, and a few days to accept with enough clarity that it had been him who destroyed everything. It wasn't a conclusion that came suddenly. It came in layers, like water finding the cracks in a structure before revealing, slowly, that the foundation was compromised from the start. In the first months after her removal, she had rejected the idea with the same energy one rejects a serious diagnosis. Then she had been angry. Then she had tried to find evidence, and then she had hit a wall of deleted documents, rebooted servers, and witnesses who disappeared before they could be formally interviewed. She had kept what she had, and she had decided to wait, not out of weakness, out of strategy. Because Maya Vance had learned, in the most expensive school there is, that acting before the right moment is as destructive as not acting at all. Now, sitting before the 3 monitors in the Drummond Holding Company data room, she read the documents with a calmness that was almost physiological, as if her body knew the time had come and was saving energy for what was to follow. Ohio Logistics was a shell company. There were no real operations, no transportation contracts, no fleet, no employees beyond the minimum administrative staff to maintain corporate formality. It was a shell built to look like a legitimate buyer of industrial assets, and behind it, through 2 layers of corporate stakes, was Thorne's money. What did Silas Thorne want with 2,000 acres in rural Pennsylvania with a flooded mine? Maya sat with that question long enough for the answer to organize itself, as always happened when she stopped searching and let the data speak. The answer wasn't in the land. It was in Drummond Holding. If Ohio Logistics acquired the land for a derisory price and then resold it at market price after a period of artificial appreciation, the profit would be real but modest. It didn't justify the structure. But if the goal was to infiltrate a Drummond Holding operation, create a channel of access to internal accounting, position a compromised asset within Drummond's portfolio, and then trigger creditors at the right moment to destabilize the entire company, the land was just the first step of something much larger. Maya stood up from the chair, went to the window, and stood for a full minute. Then she went back to the desk and started working for real. She asked for access to the communication records of the land negotiation, the correspondence between the holding company's legal department and the representatives of Ohio Logistics, and all technical reports about the mine that had been produced in the last 12 months. Vincent delivered everything without questioning, which meant Drummond had instructed exactly that. During the next 3 hours, Maya built a map, not on paper, but in her head, which was where she had always worked best. A map of connections, dates, values, and movements that apparently had no relation to each other, but which, when aligned in the correct sequence, formed an unequivocal direction. The land negotiation had started 8 months earlier. The first contact had come from a law firm in Columbus that Maya didn't recognize, but whose lead partner had made his career at a Chicago firm she knew very well, because she had been their client for years. The same firm that had advised Vance & White until 2021, and that had been, curiously, hired by Thorne immediately after her removal. It wasn't proof, but it was a pattern, and patterns were the language Maya was fluent in. She didn't say anything to Drummond that day, not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't have enough yet, and presenting an accusation without support was the kind of mistake you don't make twice, especially when the first time had already cost everything. The next morning, Maya arrived early and asked Vincent for something specific. She wanted the statements of all financial movements of Ohio Logistics in the last 36 months, with the origin and destination of each transfer, including those mediated by funds. Vincent looked at her. "That goes beyond the scope of the land negotiation," he said, with professional caution. "I know," Maya said. "That's why I'm asking." He consulted Drummond via message. The reply arrived in 40 seconds. Authorized. The statements arrived at the end of the afternoon in a 42-megabyte compressed file. Maya opened her computer at 6 p.m. and only stopped reading at 11 p.m. When she finally closed the files and turned off the monitors, There were two things absolutely clear in her head. First, Ohio Logistics wasn't just a shell for the land negotiation. It was a vehicle that had been used in the 3 years since its incorporation to move hundreds of millions of dollars between companies connected to Thorn through a corporate web sophisticated enough to confuse a conventional audit, but not the eyes of someone who knew exactly what to look for. Second, part of that money had passed through accounts Maya recognized, accounts that existed before she was removed, accounts she had questioned internally in writing. In emails Thorn had dismissed as excessive caution from an excessively conservative director. The emails still existed. She had them printed in the folder in her drawer. Maya left Atlantic Tower at 11:20 p.m. and walked to the bus stop because the rideshare app was slow. The city wind brought with it that specific temperature of autumn nights, cool enough to wake you up and soft enough not to bother you. She walked slowly. She thought of Silas Thorn. She thought of the 10 years they had worked together. She thought of the day he had stood on the other side of a meeting table and said, with his voice modulated to the frequency of convincing regret, that he was as surprised as everyone by the irregularities found. He had looked directly at her while saying it. Maya got on the bus and sat by the window. The city passed by outside at movie speed, with its lights and its contrasts and its majestic indifference to any individual drama. She needed an ally, someone on the inside who had access to what she still couldn't reach through formal documents, someone who knew Thorn's corporate structure and who had their own reasons for wanting it exposed. There was one person. There was always one person. Maya took her phone out of her pocket and stared at the number saved under a simple nickname, Clara V. She hadn't called that number in 18 months. She typed a short message. "We need to talk. It's time." She put the phone away and looked out the window until the bus reached her stop. Clara Voss was 42 years old, had a sharp intelligence she distributed sparingly, and a loyalty that survived time with the rare consistency of certain materials that do not rust. She had been a senior analyst at Vance & White for 6 years, leaving voluntarily 18 months before the scandal, because she had felt, with that instinct analytically calibrated, people develop for invisible patterns, that something was wrong. She hadn't known how to name it, but she had left. When Maya was removed, Clara had tried to contact her several times. Maya hadn't responded, not out of resentment, out of protection. Anyone associated with her at that moment risked being dragged into the blast zone, and Maya had decided with necessary coldness not to drag anyone down. The meeting happened at a coffee shop in Chelsea on Friday morning, 3 days after the message. Clara arrived first. When Maya walked in and saw her sitting in the back corner with 2 coffees already ordered, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time and took a second to identify the feeling of not being completely alone. They hugged briefly, with the containment of people who have much to say and still don't know where to start. "You vanished," Clara said. "It was necessary," Maya said. Clara didn't ask for more explanation. She knew Maya well enough to know that sentence was complete. Maya laid out the context in broad strokes. Drummond's offer, the access to documents, what she had found about Ohio Logistics and the connections to Thorn. She spoke in a low voice, without rushing, without dramatizing. She presented the facts with the same objectivity she would present a report. Clara listened to everything without interrupting. When Maya finished, she stayed silent for a few seconds, her fingers wrapped around the coffee cup without drinking. "I knew it was him," Clara said finally. "I didn't have proof, but I knew." Maya nodded. "There's more," Clara said, and her voice changed in quality, became a tone lower, more careful. "After I left the company, I started working at a compliance consultancy. One of our clients is a pension fund that has indirect stakes in 2 of the holdings you mentioned. Last year, during a routine audit, we found an inconsistency that was flagged internally and then filed away due to pressure from one of the board members." Maya went completely still. "What kind of inconsistency?" she asked. "Transfers between related companies without real operational backing," Clara said. "In total, over 4 years, we estimate about 380 million moving through this structure, without any verifiable service or product counterpart. We filed the flag because the board member threatened to terminate the contract and my management gave in. But I kept a copy of the preliminary report. The two women looked at each other. It was the kind of moment where the air of the conversation changes temperature. "You kept it as a precaution?" Maya asked. "I kept it because I knew one day someone who knew what to do with it would show up," Clara said, with a simplicity that had nothing dramatic about it. Maya thought for a moment. Then she asked something that seemed lateral but wasn't. "Do you know someone at the SEC? Not institutionally, personally." Clara tilted her head slightly to the side. "I have a contact in market supervision, a serious person, someone I worked with briefly before the consultancy." Maya drank her coffee for the first time since she had arrived. "I'm not going to ask you to expose anyone," she said, "nor to take risks you don't want to take. But I need to know if at the right moment you would be willing to formally file this flag with the documentation you kept." Clara stayed silent for a time. Maya didn't pressure. It was a real decision, with real consequences, and it needed to be made without rushing. "Yes," Clara said, "but I want to understand the whole plan first." Maya nodded. It made sense. It was what she herself would demand. In the next 3 days, Maya executed the first phase of the plan she had presented at the club, the geotechnical report. Drummond provided the contact for an engineering firm with international credentials that had worked with the holding company before, and Maya drafted the briefing with a precision that made the lead senior engineer comment that it was rare to receive such clear instructions on what needed to be evaluated. The report was issued in 48 hours. It was technical, rigorous, signed by 3 licensed professionals, and concluded with measured and conservative language that made the conclusions even heavier, that the change in the water level of the mine represented a significant risk of progressive subsidence in a strip of up to 600 feet around the perimeter of the affected area. The land where Ohio Logistics planned to build the industrial warehouse was 450 feet away. Maya delivered the report personally to the holding company's legal department and indicated the 3 lending banks that should receive the notification, not as a threat, as a good faith diligence, as a responsible company that identified a relevant risk for an operation financed by partner institutions. The legal department sent the notifications on Wednesday morning. On Wednesday afternoon, the phone at Ohio Logistics started ringing. Maya wasn't there to hear those calls. She was back in the data room working on the second phase, the one she hadn't shown Drummond yet because it wasn't the phase he had hired her for. It was the phase Maya had decided to execute on her own. She opened the statements Vincent had obtained and started reconstructing the money trail. It was a job of patience and financial geometry, the kind of thing most people give up halfway through because the data volume is too large and the apparent connections are deceptive. Maya hadn't given up halfway through anything in at least 15 years. It took 12 hours spread over 2 days to build the complete map. In the end, she had identified 6 intermediary companies, 4 accounts in different financial institutions, 2 transactions passing through offshore funds, and a single point of convergence, a Chicago-based holding company incorporated in 2018 that received and redistributed the funds with almost metronomic regularity, always at the end of the quarter, always in amounts that were slightly below the thresholds that trigger automatic reporting obligations. At the center of this holding company, as the only real partner behind a structure of proxies and delegated powers that took half an afternoon to dismantle, was Silas Thorne. Maya printed the map, folded it in 4, put it in her blazer pocket. Then she stood in front of the window for a long moment, looking at the city skyline with that specific serenity of someone who knows the hardest work is already done, and what comes next depends only on executing with precision what was planned. The time had come to talk to Drummond, not about the land, about everything, but before that she called Clara. The conversation was short and direct. Maya gave the exact coordinates of what she had found, the names of the companies, the approximate values, the dates of the most relevant movements. Clara was silent for a moment on the other end of the line, and Maya could imagine with precision the expression on her face. That mixture of confirmation and weight felt when something you suspected for years finally becomes concrete. "I'm going to call my contact at the SEC today," Clara said. "But Maya, you need to understand that once this is filed, there's no way to stop it." "I don't want to stop it," Maya said. "I want it to go where it needs to go." She hung up the phone, took a deep breath, and went to knock on Richard Drummond's office door. Richard Drummond had the habit of listening without interrupting. It was a skill he had cultivated not out of courtesy, but because he had learned early on that he who interrupts loses information, and losing information was the cardinal sin of the world he lived in. When Maya entered the office and asked for 30 minutes, he closed his laptop, placed his phone face down on the desk and said, "Speak." Maya laid the printed map on the desk between them without ceremony. "The buyer isn't who they seem to be," she began, and she went from there, methodical and direct, without unnecessary emotional inflection, building the argument layer by layer, from the simplest to the most complex, from the facade to the center. Drummond looked at the paper and at her alternately, without expressing anything on his face, which Maya had learned to interpret as maximum attention and not as disinterest. When she reached the name of Silas Thorne, Drummond paused for a second before continuing to listen. "Do you know that name?" Maya asked. "By reputation," he said. "We're in the same sector. We've crossed paths at a few events, never did business." "But he knows your company," Maya said, "better than you imagine." She explained the hypothesis. Ohio Logistics wasn't an opportunistic buyer. It was a vehicle built specifically to infiltrate a Drummond holding operation, acquire the mine land for a low price, create a hidden liability within the holding company's portfolio, and then use that liability at a strategic moment to pressure Drummond's own creditors. It was a two-move plan: first get in, then squeeze. Drummond stared at the map for a long time. "Why my company?" he asked. "There are easier targets." "Because Drummond Holding has 3 open credit lines maturing in the next 18 months, Maya said. "An unexpected liability of sufficient magnitude associated with a geological risk report that contaminates the portfolio could force renegotiations on unfavorable terms, enough to significantly reduce your market value at a time when you're preparing a funding round." Drummond remained motionless. Then he said, with a calmness that was almost admirable, "How do you know about the funding round?" "It's in the internal documents Vincent gave me access to," Maya said, without looking away. Drummond was silent for a moment, and then, for the first time since Maya had met him, he sketched something close to a real smile. "You went beyond the scope," he said. "I went where the problem was," she said. Another pause. Then, "What do you need from me to continue?" "I need the holding company to keep the negotiation with Ohio Logistics going for another 72 hours, Maya said. "Without signaling anything, without a change in stance. I need it to look like the deal is still on the table." "For what?" "Because if Thorne realizes he's been discovered before the right moment, he can dismantle the structure, dissolve the intermediary companies, and transfer the assets before any formal protocol can reach him. The window of exposure is small and will close quickly after the SEC receives the flag." Drummond tilted his head. "You've already triggered the SEC." It wasn't a question. "A reliable person with solid documentation is going to file a formal flag," Maya said. "But the timing needs to be coordinated with the moment Thorne is most exposed and least able to react. That moment is when he believes the land operation is still underway and that Ohio Logistics creditors are about to give in." "The original plan," Drummond said, "the one you presented at the club." "Which remains valid," Maya said, "and which I'm going to execute anyway because it's what you hired me to do. But it will need to happen in sync with the formal protocol, not before and not after." Drummond stood up, went to the window, and stood with his back to her for a few seconds. When he turned back, there was a decision on his face that Maya recognized because she had seen that expression in mirrors. "You have 72 hours, he said. "And Maya," he added, with a seriousness that wasn't a threat but was definitely weight, "if this goes wrong, the exposure belongs to my company." "I know," she said. "That's why it won't go wrong." She left the office and went directly to the data room. She had 72 hours and a list of things that needed to happen in the exact right sequence. First, confirm with Clara the timing of the SEC filing. The flag needed to be filed on the morning of the third day, when the effects of the geotechnical report on Ohio Logistics creditors were already mature enough to create maximum pressure on the operation. Second, ensure the holding company's law firm sent a counter-proposal to Ohio Logistics that sounded like a partial concession, not a refusal, a negotiation in progress, a signal that Drummond Holding was willing to give in on something, enough to keep Thorne confident that the plan was still working. Third, track the capital movements of Thorne Capital Holdings in real time, which required access to a Bloomberg terminal and a market analyst willing to monitor movements without asking questions about why. Vincent provided the terminal in 2 hours. The analyst arrived in the early afternoon, a man in his 30s who had worked with Drummond for 5 years and who understood, by the way Maya conducted the conversation, that the request wasn't routine, but that the person making it knew exactly what they were asking for. Maya spent the afternoon monitoring. Thorne hadn't moved anything out of pattern that day, which confirmed he didn't know yet. At 7 p.m., Clara sent a short message, confirmed for Thursday, 10 a.m. Maya looked at the message for a second. 53 hours to go. She grabbed her coat, turned off the monitors, and went down to the street. She walked to a simple restaurant 2 blocks from the tower, ordered a standard meal, ate alone at a corner table, and watched the movement on the sidewalk with that dispersed attention of someone processing a lot internally, but choosing to give their body an interval of normalcy. She thought about how she had gotten there, not with bitterness, not with premature triumph, but with the objectivity of someone taking inventory before moving on. 2.5 years serving tables, waking up before dawn with the clarity of chronic insomniacs, keeping documents in a locked drawer without knowing if they would ever serve a purpose, and then a Thursday night at an elite club, a tycoon who needed to humiliate his executives, and her with a tray in her hand in a place where no one saw her. Sometimes the right moment doesn't give warning before it arrives. It simply appears, and all that matters is if you're still standing when it passes. Maya left a generous tip on the table, more than the bill, much more than she used to leave in other times, because in other times she didn't understand what it meant to depend on that money. Now she understood. She stepped out into the warm night and walked back to the tower with the firm step of someone who has 52 hours to change everything. The next 52 hours were the densest Maya had lived since the day of her removal, but a different kind of density. Back then, the density came from the collapse, from things crumbling in a sequence too fast to hold. Now it came from the construction, from the careful control of variables that needed to converge at a single point without any of them arriving too early or too late. On Wednesday morning, Drummond Holdings' legal department sent the counter-proposal to Ohio Logistics, as Maya had directed. It was a proposal that conceded on 2 minor deadline points and kept the purchase price unchanged, which was, in practice, a response no real buyer would accept, but any intermediary would report to their client as a sign that the negotiation had a future. The goal was simple: keep them at the table, confident, without alarm. The response from Ohio Logistics arrived in 4 hours. They asked for an in-person meeting for Thursday afternoon to discuss the final terms. Maya read the message and felt something that wasn't satisfaction, but was close to the feeling of a gear clicking into the correct place. "They still don't know," she said to Vincent. He looked at her with the expression of someone starting to understand the magnitude of what was happening, but preferring not to ask questions. "Confirm the meeting," Maya said, "for 2 p.m. Meanwhile, the market analyst monitoring Thorne Capital Holdings' movements reported something relevant on Wednesday afternoon. There was a transfer leaving one of the intermediary holdings toward an offshore account. It wasn't a huge amount, about $8 million equivalent, but the timing was unusual. Thorne rarely moved international capital outside of quarter-end closings. Maya looked at the report and sat with it for a long time. It was possible it was a routine, unrelated move. It was also possible that someone, at some point in the chain, had sensed something and alerted Thorne discreetly. A transfer of that size, at that moment, could be the start of an exit strategy before any formal protocol could reach the assets. She called Clara immediately. "I need the filing to be moved up," she said. "Not Thursday morning. This afternoon." Clara was silent for 2 seconds. Maya, my contact at the SEC is going to need at least 4 hours to prepare the formal filing. It's 4 p.m. now. Then by 8 p.m., Maya said, before the market monitoring systems close for the day. Another pause. Longer this time. I'm calling him now, Clara said. Maya hung up and stared at the map of Thorne's corporate structure she had printed and taped to the data room wall, because sometimes it helped to see the connections physically, at scale, with the lines drawn by hand connecting the names. It was a web of a technical elegance she would have admired in other circumstances. There was intelligence in that architecture. There was also, hidden in the sophisticated engineering, a specific arrogance. The arrogance of someone who believes the complexity they built is enough to make them invisible. Maya knew that arrogance well. She had been a victim of it. At 6:30, Clara called back. It's confirmed, she said. The filing will be delivered personally at 9 p.m. with a copy to the market supervision area. The documentation includes the preliminary report I kept, the statements you mapped, and a technical cover letter my contact will sign. Maya breathed. Thank you, Clara. Don't thank me yet, Clara said, with that dry humor Maya had forgotten she loved. Wait to see what happens tomorrow. What happened on Thursday morning was precise and fast, in the way things only happen when the pieces are all in the right place and someone moves them in the correct sequence. At 8:40 a.m., the SEC monitoring systems identified the overnight movements of Thorne Capital Holdings as consistent with the pattern described in the protocol received the previous night. An internal alert was generated automatically, which triggered the preventive freezing of the accounts linked to the identified structure while the formal analysis was conducted. Silas Thorne found out at 9:15 when his CFO tried to process a routine transfer and received a block message. Maya found out at 9:20 when the market analyst walked into the data room with the monitoring report in his hands and the expression of someone who had just watched something they didn't expect to see so clearly. She read the report, closed the folder, sat for a moment. Then she called Drummond. It's happening, she said. The meeting with Ohio Logistics this afternoon probably won't happen. Have legal prepare to receive a termination notice in the next few hours. Drummond was silent for a moment. How did you know it would be today? He asked. I didn't, Maya said honestly, but it had to be before he moved more capital. The window was small. Another pause. And the land? Drummond asked. It's still yours, Maya said, and with Thorne Capital's assets preventively frozen, there's an opportunity to acquire the assets associated with Ohio Logistics for a value that might surprise you favorably. Drummond took exactly 4 seconds to respond. Send me the numbers when you have them. Maya hung up the phone and looked out the window. Outside, the city remained exactly like itself, indifferent and magnificent, with that unique capacity to contain both collapse and renewal at the same time, without either completely contaminating the other. She thought of Silas Thorne at that moment, thought of the phone that must be ringing in his Chicago office, the calls that would have no satisfactory answer, the advisors trying to understand what had jammed and why. She thought of the expression he must have at that instant and recognized, without pleasure, but with an honesty she owed herself, that she had waited for that image for 2 years and 5 months. There was no triumph in what she felt. There was something more solid than triumph. It was the specific feeling of a debt that isn't about money but about truth, finally settled. She stood up, went to the bathroom, washed her face with cold water, looked at her own reflection for a second, and went back to the data room. There was still work to do. The most important work was still to come. The most important work was the meeting with Drummond Holdings investors, scheduled weeks ago for Friday morning in a conference hall at a high-end hotel, where Drummond concentrated much of his relationship operations. 17 investors, including institutional funds and high-net-worth individuals, summoned for a portfolio update and outlook for the next cycle. Maya knew about the meeting from Vincent's calendar and knew, without needing confirmation, that she needed to be in that room. She asked for a conversation with Drummond late Thursday afternoon. I need to be at tomorrow's meeting, she said. Drummond didn't show surprise. To do what? He asked. To present what happened this week, Maya said. Not as a crisis averted, as a demonstration of the kind of strategic intelligence a company like this needs to have permanently. Drummond was silent for a moment, and Maya didn't fill that silence. "You'll be there," he said, "but when you walk into that room, you walk in as the holding company's director of strategy, not as a passing consultant." "Is that a job offer?" she asked. "It's a statement of intent that you can confirm or decline tomorrow after the meeting," Drummond said. "But I prefer you walk in knowing what you represent." Maya nodded, left the office and went down to the sidewalk. The afternoon sun hit the asphalt and the air had that scent of the coast. She called Clara. "Is it resolved?" Clara asked. "The most urgent part, yes," Maya said. "There's one more thing tomorrow." "There always is," Clara said, and this time there was a smile in her voice. Maya hung up and looked at the city for a moment. Then she went back inside. She had a presentation to prepare, and preparing presentations was something Maya Vance had done very well for at least 15 years. The conference hall at the Atlantic Hotel had a capacity for 40 people and was occupied by 17 investors who collectively shared a limited patience and a very specific expectation. They wanted to hear that Drummond Holding was solid, that the portfolio was growing as projected, and that the funding round Drummond had signaled for the second half of the year was a real opportunity and not a pressure move. Maya arrived at 8:50 with the slides loaded on a flash drive and the composure of someone who slept well, which was a half-truth because she had slept 4 hours, but she had slept deeply, and 4 hours of real sleep are worth more than 8 hours of anxious wakefulness. Drummond introduced her to the investors with the characteristic brevity of someone who doesn't need many words to give weight to something. "Maya Vance, the holding company's director of strategy, will present an overview of this week's operation before our portfolio update." There was a shift in posture in the room. Some recognized the name, others didn't. Those who recognized it exchanged brief glances with the specific containment of people trained not to show surprise in business environments. Maya turned on the projector and began without preamble. On Monday of this week, Drummond Holding identified an infiltration attempt into its portfolio through an acquisition vehicle of legitimate appearance. I'm going to explain what it was, how it was identified and how it was neutralized. And then I'm going to explain what this means for the health of the portfolio and for the funding round being prepared. The room went very quiet. Maya presented the facts in chronological order and with the precision of someone who built the argument to be understood by intelligent people who didn't necessarily have the same technical context as her. She explained the structure of Ohio Logistics, the corporate chain leading to Thorn, the intention to position a hidden liability within the portfolio, and the sequence of actions that had led to the preventive freezing of the related accounts and the filing away of the negotiation. There was no dramatism in the presentation, there was clarity, and clarity in that context was much more powerful than any drama. When she finished, the room was silent for a few seconds. The first to speak was a 60-year-old man who represented the largest institutional fund among those present, a fellow with a deep voice and economic vocabulary whom Maya had identified, even before she started speaking, as the hardest to convince in the room. "How did you identify the pattern before it caused damage?" he asked. "Because I've seen this pattern before," Maya said. "From the inside." The sentence fell with a weight she had calculated. There were 2 types of possible reactions, suspicion or recognition. The 60-year-old man stared at her for a moment, and then, with a slight tilt of the head that was probably the maximum recognition he handed out, said only, "Understood." Another investor, younger, asked about the holding company's residual exposure, if the SEC investigation revealed broader connections. Maya answered with the numbers. There was no direct exposure. The negotiation had been kept in a preliminary phase deliberately, which meant no financial commitment had been signed and no assets had changed hands. The only real cost had been the geotechnical report, which cost $18,000 and which had functioned beyond the immediate purpose as an instrument that made the mineland significantly more interesting in the market, because now there was detailed technical documentation about the subsoil that serious buyers valued. The land that had been described as a useless asset was now a documented asset, with complete geological documentation and a history of a failed acquisition attempt that created a value narrative that hadn't existed before. The 60-year-old man made a sound that could have been approval, or could have just been the adjustment of his chair. Drummond took the floor to continue the original meeting agenda, and Maya sat beside him with the same composure she had held while standing during the presentation. But something was different now. The room had changed configuration without a single chair having moved. Maya's place in that space was different than it had been when she walked in. The meeting lasted 2 more hours. Maya answered technical questions when requested and stayed silent when she wasn't needed, which was the skill that distinguished strategists from consultants, knowing the exact moment to stop talking. When the investors began to leave, the 60-year-old man stopped beside Maya for a second. "I worked with Vance and White in the final years," he said. "When you were still there." Maya didn't say anything. She waited. "I regretted what happened," he said. "It was an evident waste." "Thank you," Maya said simply. He nodded and left. Maya stared at the door for a moment. Drummond appeared at her side with 2 cups of coffee. "How are you?" he asked, which was, coming from Drummond, a genuinely unusual question. "Fine," Maya said, with honesty. He handed her one of the cups. "You have an answer for me," he said, "the one I left open yesterday." Maya drank the coffee. She stared out the hall window, where the Friday morning sun entered with that specific luminosity of autumn mornings, clear and slightly damp, with the kind of light that makes the city seem to have started from scratch that day. "I have one condition," she said. Drummond waited, which was what he did well. "Clara Voss comes in with me," Maya said. "She has compliance expertise this company is going to need in the coming months, and she was fundamental to what happened this week. I don't come without her." Drummond was silent for a second. Then he said, "Send me her resume on Monday." Maya set the cup on the table. "Then I'm confirmed," she said. "You've been confirmed since Wednesday," Drummond said. "I was just waiting for you to get there." Maya didn't respond, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something she had forgotten the name of, and that now returned with the silent naturalness of things that always belonged to a person and were simply waiting for the right moment to be returned. It was the feeling of being exactly in the place where she should be, and of knowing, with a certainty that didn't need any external confirmation, that this time it was for keeps. That afternoon, Maya went to the golf club for the last time as an employee. She handed her folded apron to the coordinator with a genuine thank you, because that job had been a shelter when there was no other. And she couldn't not recognize that. The coordinator, a pragmatic woman who had respected Maya's silence for 2 years without ever asking for explanations, shook her hand with a firmness that said more than any word could. Maya left through the same hallway she had walked hundreds of times with the tray on her arm, this time without a tray. She went through the service door, turned into the main hallway, crossed the lobby where the members moved with that particular lightness of those who never needed to calculate the cost of anything, and walked out through the main entrance for the first time. The afternoon sun hit the sidewalk with the specific generosity of April late afternoons. Maya paused for a second on the sidewalk, looked at the sky and moved forward. A week later, the Liberty Heights Golf Club received Richard Drummond again in the private room on the 3rd floor. This time, the table had 8 people, not 7. And this time Maya Vance didn't enter through the service door. She arrived via the main elevator, with Clara Voss at her side, both with folders and the posture of those who have much to present and know exactly how to present it. Drummond was waiting for them standing by the window, with the same gesture Maya had learned to read as a form of deliberate equalization, and around the table were 4 of the investors present at Friday's meeting, plus the holding company's legal director, and Vincent, who had assumed the role of interface between Maya and the rest of the company's operational structure in recent days. The agenda was the formal consolidation of the portfolio protection strategy for the next funding cycle. Maya and Clara had spent the last few days building an extended due diligence protocol that covered not just the assets under negotiation, but the corporate structures of all potential commercial partners, with special attention to acquisition vehicles incorporated less than 5 years ago without verifiable operational history. It was, in corporate language, a system that made the kind of operation Thorne had set up much harder to execute in silence. Not impossible, because human ingenuity applied to the wrong purpose was a resource that never ran dry, but considerably harder. Maya presented the protocol with the same objective clarity as the previous Friday. Clara complemented it with the compliance perspective, and the two alternated with the fluency of those who had worked together for years, even if the real joint work had started less than 2 weeks ago. It was the kind of synergy you can't manufacture. Either it exists or it doesn't. The 60-year-old investor, who had stayed silent for much of Friday's meeting, asked more questions this time. They were good questions, the kind that test the solidity of reasoning without trying to tear it down for vanity. Maya answered them all, and when he was satisfied, she knew he was satisfied because he stopped asking, which was the most direct way there was of saying the argument had held up. At the end of the meeting, while those present stood up and talked in small groups with the lightness of those who just spent 2 hours solving complex problems and are ready for the next break, Maya stood by the window. The same window from where, a week earlier, she had looked at the city with that mixture of clarity and weight that precedes an irreversible decision. Clara appeared at her side with 2 coffees. "How are you?" Clara asked, using exactly the same words Drummond had used on Friday. "Fine," Maya said for the second time that week with the same honesty as before. The two stayed silent for a moment, looking at the city outside. The river sparkled in the midday sun, with that variable coloration that changed with the clouds, sometimes green, sometimes blue, sometimes almost golden, depending on the angle of the light. "About Thorn," Clara said carefully. "The investigation will take time." "I know," Maya said, "and it's going to be uncomfortable. They're going to ask about you too, about the period you worked together." "I know," Maya said again, "but this time I have the documents, and this time I have a place to be while I wait." Clara nodded. On the other side of the room, Drummond looked at the two of them for a second, before turning his attention back to the investor he was talking to. It was a brief look, almost imperceptible, but one Maya caught with the precision she had learned to catch discrete signals in environments where people communicated much more through what they didn't say than what they did. It was a look that recognized. And recognizing in that world was the most honest form of respect there was. In the following days, the trade press specialized in the financial market published discreet notes about the preventive freezing of Thorn Capital Holdings accounts. Silas Thorn's name appeared among the administrators of the affected companies. The language was cautious, as it always is when talking about ongoing investigations, but the direction was unequivocal for those who knew how to read. Maya read the notes in her new office on the 17th floor of Atlantic Tower, in a room with a small plant in the window she had bought the previous week because she had decided it was time to start truly inhabiting spaces, not just using them. She read, closed the computer, and went to work. There was a portfolio analysis to deliver, a meeting with legal at 2 p.m., and a call with a fund in New York that Drummond had asked her to conduct directly. It was a full day, the kind of day that had been missing for 2 years and that now arrived back with all its density and its weight and its demand. And Maya discovered there was a very specific kind of joy in that, not the euphoric joy of movies, but the silent joy of someone who recognizes they are back to what they know how to do and what they like to do and what they are good at doing. Through the 17th floor window, the city continued being the city. Indifferent and magnificent, contradictory and vital, full of stories that started in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes, when the pieces aligned the right way, arrived exactly where they needed to be. Maya looked at the city for a second. Then she went back to the screen. There was work to do. And she was finally exactly where the work needed her, the work. Dear listeners, Maya Vance's story has come to an end, but your journey of discovery can continue right here with us. If her trajectory touched you, if you were on the edge of your seat waiting for every twist, then you know what we do on this channel. Stories that leave no one indifferent. Every week we bring narratives like this, where the silence of those who were ignored speaks louder than any speech, where strategic patience is worth more than impulsive haste, and where true power always finds its way. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, it's time to do that now, because the next stories are just as powerful as this one, and you won't want to miss a single one. Leave your like. It tells us that every word was worth it. And tell us in the comments, at what moment in Maya's story did you realize she had control of the game? Your response is what keeps us going. Until the next story. The end.